All right, everyone, welcome back. Today on the show, legendary 1980s disc jockey Bryan Schock discusses the dawn of alternative music and his 100,000-watt flamethrower. Well, Chris, I'm so excited today. We have been talking a lot, obviously, on this show about the early days of San Diego, especially back in the 80s. And one of the big things we talked about, you guys, is when our favorite radio station, 91X, made a giant decision to change formats from a traditional rock and roll type mainstream station to what back then was a brand new term for us, new wave or alternative.
Cutting edge of rock.
On the cutting edge of rock, 91X, right? So we are ecstatic that on today's show, we were able to meet up with Bryan Schock, who was there from the early inception of that format change and really has a handle on what it was like being a DJ for one of the most popular radio stations back then, when New Wave and New Romantics and Depressed Mode and The Cure and all those bands were really kind of getting into our subconscious and were playing on the radio waves for the first time, frankly. So without further ado, Chris, let's switch over to this really cool chat that we had with Bryan Schock.
Let's do it.
I guess you guys are from here, right? You're from San Diego?
Yes.
So, that's where I'd probably start with things, because I am from here as well.
Right.
My parents moved here when I was really young. When I was probably, 11, 12, 13 years old, I was already trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I remember having this dream, and I was in a radio studio playing music, and I remember waking up from that going, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to play music for people on the radio. And so I started to pursue that. I went to Torrey Pines High School, and in school I took like drama classes and different classes that I thought, speech and things like that I thought would help. And then I ended up at San Diego State, and the program back then, to get into the program, you had to be a little bit further along, and I was a little antsy. I wanted to get running with this thing quicker than they were letting me. 91X at this time was playing, it was a rock station. It was not an alternative station yet. They were playing a lot of just extremely, it was so boring. It was 200 songs. All you could say on the air was, here's a block of Loverboy on 91X. And that's about all you could say.
That's horrible.
Yeah. They were playing album sides in the middle of the night because they didn't have a jock in there. So, and it was down in Mexico, right? So the record labels at that point were really worried about the recording of music on the radio. I don't know if you remember the whole campaign where, taping is killing music or whatever the hell they had out there. But so they basically threatened to cut off any record service to 91X if they continued to play these record sides. So they needed to get somebody quickly. I send a tape, no resume, down there with somebody else. Somebody else brought it to them. And I got a phone call the next day, and I was hired. I never even met the PD face to face. That's how I got in.
Huh.
That's how I started at 91X.
Wow.
We need a person. I'm a person.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Well, there were a few people who applied, but thank God they wanted me. And, I was barely 21 at the time. Really didn't have any smarts about me in terms of business and everything else at this point. And, I didn't realize that how fragile this job could actually be. I just was going in there and doing it. And as I said, all you could say at this point was like, here's a block of Loverboy on 91X, block of Pat Benatar on 91X.
Bryan, what was a block back then? How many songs is a block or
It would probably have been 3, I think. I think they were 3 songs. And the block party thing was their thing. At that time you had KGB, you had KPRI, and you had 91X. And 91X was far and away the third wheel of the 3 rock stations.
We thought we were getting a block that was like a bonus to us, but it was actually kind of the opposite, right? It was they were doing it just that was their process, right? To not have DJs talking in between.
Well, and they really did not let you talk. Now, the other thing you guys should know is that growing up, although I did like the MTV era stuff, I was a rocker. Now, I listened to a lot of different kinds of music, and I remember, if I go back to like the Christmas, I think of 75, I got Kiss Alive and George Benson Breezin'. I like a lot of different types of music, but at this point, I really was more into hard rock. So I went to a Judas Priest show, and I came into the studio after the show, and it's midnight, and it's down in Tijuana, and I turned the mic on, and I spent about 60 to 90 seconds passionately talking about how great this Judas Priest show was. And the phone rings, which did not happen very often down there. The phone situation there was they had people on this side of the border who would take all the requests and then call the requests down to the jock. And there was nobody on doing that in the middle of the night. So I pick the phone up, and it's the program director, and he starts to, tear me a new one. You're not supposed to say more than 7 words, blah, 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 blah. It's like, and I was really questioning whether I wanted to do this or not. It was like, this is not what I signed up for. I want to play music for people.
What are you even doing if you're not talking? I don't even understand, right?
Yeah.
You're just...
I wanted to, my whole thing is I'm real passionate about this, and I want to express my passion. And there was no expressing passion at this place. So, I was actually debating whether or not I wanted to do this. And it was only about 2 months later, we all got called in to a meeting, and they let us know that at 6:00 that night, they were going to play Stairway to Heaven. And after that song, flip the format to what was rock of the 80s. And Mad Max was the one who was on the air at that time. And I was actually the second jock because I followed Max. So technically, I was the second jock on the new format.
Excellent.
At first, I was the youngest person in there. Who was part of this, and I knew the music. It just wasn't a lot of that stuff was not my preference at that point. Like I said, I was really into Rush and, just all those bands of the late 70s and early 80s. That's what I was into. But I'll tell you, at least I knew what was going on, because there were some people there. I don't know if you remember Sue Delany, but
of course,
Sue was working at 91X at that time. And she had absolutely no idea what any of this stuff was, and nor did she care. And she didn't last that long there. She ended up going over across the street over to KGB anyway, which was a better fit for her. And but I remember like a lot of the stuff we were playing was because the music was, a lot of it was coming from overseas. And the only way that we could get it, because everything was vinyl, by the way, there was no CDs or anything. And so we were getting 12-inch singles that were supposed to be played at 45. And I remember driving down there one day and hearing the Thompson Twins' Lies. And it's going, lies, 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 yeah. And I'm like, oh my God.
They're going to get you.
Like this person's playing, who's ever on the air right now is playing this thing at 33 instead of 45. And having no clue that they're playing it at the wrong speed. So I was one of the only people who was on the staff at that time who really got the music. Max did, for sure. And Max ended up becoming the program director of the radio station not long after. But that was an exciting time because, nobody was doing anything like that. And we went from being, the also ran of the 3 rock stations to like really quickly people were, oh my God, this is great. Nobody else is doing this. And it was, all the music you were hearing on MTV at the time, the alternative stuff, not the pop stuff. But we did play like Petty. There was a Stones or a Beatles song that was thrown in there and things like that. And the imaging was different too. It was more irreverent type imaging than you were hearing on other rock radio stations.
Yeah, I mean, and that's definitely relatable to us, Bryan, especially because we were just a couple years behind you in high school, and so that hit. And Jeff and I talked about that. We had an episode a while back, and it was funny because one of our listeners had actually said, "Hey, again, a local, you really got to talk about the stations and the DJs and everything else." It's like, yeah, we always kind of implied or made references to it, but then we very specifically we had an episode where we talked about it, and for us, already kind of leaning in that way, in that direction. But it was huge to have that sort of who's looking in here on the radio. And it's funny, Rush was actually my first concert that I went to.
Oh, was it?
The moving pictures yeah. So I could still appreciate that. And I still appreciate that now. But that turn where we had that, there was something different and that music. And for us, it's not an overstatement to really kind of shape who we were and who we became just because, we had something that was kind of more ours in that regard, right?
Yeah.
Because this was, even though, for a few years you'd had, if you want to talk about the Sex Pistols or the Clash, or the people even came before them when it was like, Iggy Pop or whatever. But we had it and it was fresh and we had access to it. So, how was that transition then? Did you just kind of get, like I said, it sounds like you just moved right into it.
I did. Yes, I did, but I have to say, some of it took me a minute. I was already into Elvis Costello. Like I bought My Aim Is True when it came out. I bought the first Joe Jackson record when it came out. I was like I've already said here, I liked a lot of different type of music. And, back then you'd walk in a record store and you'd hear, whatever they were playing in there. And that was your exposure to it, or you'd hear it on the radio. Well, nobody was playing Elvis Costello and Joe Jackson on the radio at that point. So I was, I buy things here and there, but somebody like Duran or, my exposure to Duran was seeing a video on MTV. And I wasn't really into the Clash or the Sex Pistols or anything back in the late 70s when they first emerged. But I became, more familiar with them. And I really embraced the music and I liked all of it. I mean, you had some pretty cheesy stuff that was on the air at that time. And then you had stuff that was, nobody was going to take Culture Club all that serious or Wham all that serious, but that, their place in this whole thing, they were fun, right? I mean, they were more about a party than where you have the Sex Pistols or the Clash who are trying to make a statement about something. Mm-hmm. And then the other part of what happened with that radio station at the time is, everybody had to have some kind of a different type of name. You weren't just going to use your regular old name. So, Max was Mad Max and Billy was Billy Bones. And my first initial is T. Bryan is my middle name and Schock is my last name. My first name is actually Tad, T-A-D. I can't stand the name, but I was T. Bryan Schock back then. And that's the only time that I've used, that when I about 3 years later, I ended up at KGB and I say I ended up at KGB and I dropped the T. So, but it was an interesting time, to be involved. I went from literally, I don't know if I want to do this, to, oh my God, this is exciting and fun. And we were involved in the community and we were out all the time. And, there was the promotional stuff that was going on was more creative, and the people that were involved in it were more passionate about music. And you got to be and talk about music passionately on the air. So what I was wishing for actually came true.
That is so cool. And Bryan, for those of you listening in that weren't here in Southern California during that time, or you're just not familiar with what music might have been like back then, music was a huge deal for everybody. And Bryan, I oftentimes think about the old 1970s movies, The Warriors. You know that movie, right? Obviously,
yeah.
Where you've got all these gangs in in New York. And they all have like super unique identities, the baseball Furies and all of it. I thought of it that way in Southern California with bands and with the type of music you liked, because as you remember, as a kid growing up, right, it was a big deal to identify with music, and that was a part of your personality, and that's how other people in school, categorized you. And man, you could get in fights over it. You dressed the part.
Mm-hmm.
It was a cultural thing, like, what are you into, man? Oh, dude, you're into whatever, Scritti, Politi, and Haysi, Fantayzee, and Toto, Coelo, and what? Versus like the classic Led Zeppelin dudes. That's a fight.
The smoking section.
So I will say, Bryan, that when you guys did that format change, you had huge fans just waiting for someone to finally represent them in this weird music that was finally going to be different than what was played all the time. And by the way, all the bands you mentioned are amazing bands, obviously Rush and all those bands, I get it. But those are the bands that you would hear again and again and again. And this was
in other
music
places
that we're all like, come on, man, give me something new, And so it was a big deal. Yeah.
So when I was in high school, and I can look back in my yearbook today and see it, what you were just talking about is 100% true. For me, I was into Kiss, I was into Cheap Trick, and bands such as this, and I would bring the album, like a new album would come out, I'd bring it to school. Like that's, you're talking about the pride in the music and everything. And things were so different because your exposure to music before MTV, your only exposure to music was via radio. And even after MTV, radio was the way that you found new music. And I will tell you, from being in this business for over 40 years now, we were rock stars back in the 80s. I mean, as DJs, we were absolutely rock stars back then. Now, nobody cares. But back then, we were freaking rock stars. I'd be lying to you if I said otherwise. I mean, it was a blast. And the 90s were fun. And then the 2000s, it started to become less. And, because there were other things and other ways of finding music. And not that they were bad. I mean, I think everything that's happened through my life in terms of music, there's always been some cool new, way to find music and expose people to music. And it's just a matter of participating in that or not. If you tried to fight it, like Metallica did with Napster, it could end up biting you in the rear end. And that one didn't go well for them.
No, claiming that you own the E chord it's a pretty bold claim, I would say. If you're Lars over there in Metallica, that's a bold claim.
And the labels made a lot of mistakes with that too, because it's like it's a tidal wave coming in on you right now. Figure out how you can ride it as opposed to try to push it back. You're not going to push that back. It's running over you. And the labels really took a big hit from that. I mean, the business is so different now, and that could be an entirely different podcast altogether.
Oh yeah.
The radio and record business, but meeting the people, like, as I'm assuming one of the reasons we're sitting here and having this conversation is, that I do this show on Alt 94.9 now. It's Steve West Legends of Alternative, and Steve was a big part of what 91X was at that time. Do you guys know the name Rick Carroll by chance? You probably wouldn't. Rick Carroll was the brainchild behind K-Rock back in the early 80s and had flipped them to the rock of the 80s. And Rick Carroll was involved in all of the architecture of what 91X became. So we were pretty much a reflection, but San Diego's version of what K-Rock was in LA at that time. And, K-Rock had their British guy, Richard Blade, right? And Rodney was there too. But so Steve, they were looking for a British guy, and Steve was our British guy. And I'll never forget the first time that I met Steve, and I have told this story before, but not everybody's heard it. We're in a shack, literally in a shack down in Tijuana, up on a hill. And there's 2 studios in there. There's a desk and kind of a lobby and a bathroom. And on the other side of these glass doors is a 100,000 watt transmitter, which to this day, I'm surprised I didn't get cancer from this thing. And that's it.
That's overkill, man.
You have a Mexican national who's there, and that's all part of the deal, is that you have to have somebody there representing, because it's a Mexican license. And I loved all those guys that I worked with, all the guys who were in there. I guess they call them operators or something like that. They weren't. I don't think they were technically engineers. They were there to deal with any problems if anything arose. But and then you, and that was it. It's just the 2 of you. And when you're walking in there to take over a shift, obviously who's ever on the air is there. Well, I walk in one night and it's 11:45, and there's Steve West sitting there. And I'm thinking to myself, why in the hell is this guy in here at almost midnight? And he says, "Hello, my name's Steve." And I meet him, and I'm thinking to myself, this guy's going to take my job. They're going to give him my job. And Max, assures me that's not the case. And they end up putting Steve on in the daytime. But Steve didn't leave Mexico. Steve lived down there. And he lived, I guess, down by the beach. And I thought to myself, wow, this British guy comes in and he loves Tijuana so much, he's living down here. Well, I come to find years later, because nobody told me anything back then, that Steve had been working in Orange, or up in San Clemente. And they brought him down there to take a look at the place. And when they were coming back across the border, when he was pulling out his ID, the Border Patrol officer noticed a pay stub. And Steve did not have the proper documentation to be working legally in the United States. So they wouldn't let him back into the country. And he was living in Mexico because he had no choice.
He was in exile. Wow.
So eventually, John Lynch, who was the general manager of 91X at the time, jumped through a lot of hoops. And I believe he flew back to England with Steve to help him get all of his paperwork together so he would be able to come here and work in the United States and go back and forth across the border. But, and Steve and I were good friends for many, many years. Obviously, how close we were over that time depended on kind of where I was at, because I was there for 3 years. The first 3 years of my career, I was at 91X. But I was in overnights, and then they'd put me in nights, and then they'd find somebody else. Oh, here's Pam Wolf. We're going to throw her in there. And so Bryan goes back to overnights, and it just was a back and forth thing. And I got kind of frustrated, and I made friends with John Leslie. I don't know if you remember John Leslie.
Oh, I remember. Yeah,
KGB.
definitely. He had that deep, deep voice.
Yeah, and John and I shared the same birthday, although he was 9 years older than I. And he helped me make some friends over at KGB. And as I've told you guys, my heart was in harder rock. And so I ended up leaving 91X for KGB. But I will tell you, there was a lot of that music I loved that we were playing at 91X. That Rio record to this day is, in my opinion, is one of the great records that has ever been released. And if you listen to the bass playing on that record, it's insanely good. I mean, these guys were not just flaky pop musicians. They
It's
were
like a jazz
very,
bass
very
player.
solid. Oh,
No, he's all over the
unbelievable.
place. Oh, yeah.
He is all over the place.
It's funky is what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, there were a lot of records I really, really enjoyed from that time period, and a lot of singles that were fun. And there were certain, I wasn't a coffee drinker. I talk about this on the air from time to time. I just don't drink coffee, and doing overnights, how do you stay up? I'd just put a song on. I will tell you guys this, confession right here. I broke format a lot because it was the middle of the night. There was no way to detect it unless you were actually listening.
Right.
And it's like,
Highway to Hell.
It was more like, we play Rio a lot. I think I want to play Last Chance on the Stairway right now because I really could use a pickup. And I would go deeper into the records. You know, Thomas Dolby, let's play Airwaves instead of, Europa or something like that. So I would cheat a lot in the overnight shift. That was the one fun part about it.
That's cool, man.
I don't think if they ever heard it, nobody ever called me out on it. So
I was going to say, at least you didn't flip formats. All you did was a deep cut, right? That wasn't really the approved.
Right.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah.
It's great you had that freedom.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't really have that freedom.
Well,
No,
you took the liberty, let's just say.
Took it. Yeah. Brian, just as a side question, I'm kind of fascinated. Why Tijuana? Were transmitters hard to find? Were there only a certain limited number of them? And that's why 91X adopted one that was in Tijuana?
This is a great question. You have only so many spots on the dial, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know exactly how it gets laid out, but all of the radio stations that are north of the border start with C. Okay. Everything west of the Mississippi starts with K. Everything east of the Mississippi starts with W, with the exception of a couple of radio stations that were, some of the first stations. And then everything south of the border starts with an X. All of the call letters do. If you're a border radio, if you're on the border like San Diego is, only one, like we can't have a 91.1 on this side of the border and on that side of the border. They'll just fight with each other and you will hear nothing. The signals will clash.
Oh, okay.
So
Gotcha.
I don't know who, which government or how they figured out like these stations will be, Mexican licensed stations and these will be U.S. But so those are just Mexican. They're Mexican licensed. They're owned by the Mexican government. The Noble Broadcasting, who was the owner of 91X, and I use air quotes, didn't actually own. They owned it down there. Ed Noble was Mexican. That you can't be as far as I know, and I don't think anything's changed with this, but you cannot be in the U.S. and own you can't buy the stations down there. Right. They have to be owned by a Mexican national.
I think I've heard that. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's what that is. But that's a great question. So
yeah,
and 100,000 watts was way more wattage than you were allowed to have here in the United States. And that thing's a flamethrower up this way. You can hear 91X. Yeah. Along the coast, you can hear it up into like Long Beach and such because it'll skip over the water or whatever.
Okay, I get it now. There's only so many slots on the dial, to your point. And if you're going to choose 91, well, there's the transmitter right there that's just south of the border, and it's going to easily make it to the U.S. with 100,000 watts. So,
they were willing to broadcast in English too. And I don't know all the ins and outs of how you get the Mexican government to allow you to broadcast in English because Z90, Magic, these stations are all on their transmitters are south of the border. What finally happened, we had to drive across because they didn't have the technology, or if they did, it was way too expensive to be able to send the signal from here to the transmitter there and then have it go. But
Okay.
I want to say it was, I think when Berger and Prescott went to 91X from KGB to 91X, that part of their deal was they weren't going to drive across the border. They were only going to take the job if they could do it on this side. And that's when they finally made it so you didn't have to drive across any longer.
Okay. I forgot about Berger and Prescott. My God, that's a poll that I forgot about. Wow.
I can go on and on. I mean, most of my career is here in San Diego. I have moved and worked in other places, but a great part of my career has been here in town.
Can you still do the Bryan? I'm sure when you go to sleep at night, you're still hearing this. The little call out. Equise, FAMA, Baja California, Mexico.
Okay, here's a fun one on that. I did that live once, and I got in trouble because once again, the laws down in Mexico, that has to be done by a Mexican national.
It's like a union gig or something. Yeah.
Yeah. It's that legally, that has to be done by a Mexican national.
Okay.
So that voice has to belong to a Mexican national.
But can you do it for us really quick? Let's listen to Bryan doing it. It's legal now, Bryan. You're okay.
Equise, FM, Baja California, Mexico.
Everybody knows exactly.
There you go.
Like
wow.
says.
Well, how many thousands and thousands of times did we hear that as we were hauling ass down to the beach in our VW Bug? Man, that's so cool. Yeah.
Well, if you were up late or up early or up all night, you also heard the Mexican national anthem not once but twice.
I was just going to ask. Right.
Yeah, that had to be played twice. Yeah.
Right. The PSAs that were required, and you'd be, in between, but definitely, you could set your clock or your watch or whatever. Now nobody does that, but literally here comes, and that's a long anthem. That's not like
very long,
60 seconds. It's like, I'm going to go get something to eat and I'll have to microwave it and I'll go back. And that anthem is still playing.
It's also so weird when it's sandwiched between Wide Boy Awake and the Buzzcocks. It's like, this is a strange, mix.
It was the price that was paid to be able to do something, very unique and cutting edge.
Well, it sounds like obviously
cutting
like
edge.
The format
that was
change,
the motto.
Bryan, the format changed, even though like what you responded to and what important, but just the music you gravitated toward, but then you moved over to KGB, which was more up your alley. But obviously you've moved around. As a DJ, do you have to have, I guess to be a good DJ, maybe do you have to have a passion for the music, or do some people just like, man, I'm just putting the records down, I'm reading the liners, I got a commercial here. Does it help? Or does it make a huge difference to really, really feel passionate about
I think
the
it depends on what you're doing as far as on air. Because one of the things that I figured out, having the passion for the music, one of the things I figured out early on is that I'm never going to really get to play what I want to play on the air all the time unless I'm a program director. So I started working towards that.
Now, as you're on Sunday mornings on Legends of Alternative, Steve West, Legends of Alternative. I want to make sure I get the name right. I listen to it. I know a lot of people engage. And I guess going back to that music, to the stuff when they flip the switch on 91X and the artists, and so much of that time period, right, of the 80s, just pop culture wise, resonates. And the music still does. And whenever you talk about the show, because you've been embedded in it for decades. Why do you think that is? Nobody sits there, and you hear the knock, the other stuff, that whether it's people talking about yacht rock and this sort of genre and everything else. But I don't think, to me, though, from where I sit or from how I listen, and then Jeff would be the same way, because again, why does it resonate? Why can you even have that? And again, I listen to the show and the songs that come up, the blocks, the deeper cuts. It's just like, to me, and I don't know, like, I'm a kid again, and maybe that's part of it. But why do you think, out of all the genres out there, and why do you think, again, that you get that sort of engagement? Was it just catching the right music, the right artist, the right time? Or what is it, again, from managing all that, from playing those songs all these years later?
I think it's a couple of things. The Legends of Alternative show, when I sit down to do the show, and when I sit down to actually do any kind of programming of music, I want to make sure I always look at it kind of like a plate of food. What's my main course and what are the side dishes? And if we're just only eating meat, that gets boring and old. You've got to have some other things in there, and they have to be mixed in properly. If I just roll with a lot of the same thing, you're going to get bored with that. I try to bring tempo up and down. I try to bring emotion up and down. And I think that there's so much to choose from with the music from that era. So much to choose from. I mean, if you want to just, spend an hour of darkness, well, let's just play the Smiths, The Cure, and Depeche Mode. But there's, I love the new romantic part of the 80s. So many of those bands were just so, and so, some of them could get you beat up at school. But, but I mean that there's some really great stuff that was part of that new romantic movement. The punk stuff. I will tell you right now, I've never stopped learning about music and songs, and I've been exposed to a lot of the music from that era through doing this show over the last 5-6 years. I didn't know a number of these songs. And there's other stuff that I do know that people who listen to the show don't know. But one of the beautiful things about me having the Facebook group page is that I ask listeners for input. I ask them to give me, requests, suggestions. And I have been exposed to a lot of music that I didn't know or had forgotten about. I'll put something on. I'm like, oh, God, yeah, we did play that on 91X. I haven't heard that song in 40 years. I think that, it's a combination of all of those things. And it's not just the music. It's the music and where the music was placed. The films of that time period mean something to people. John Hughes really touched on something with his movies. And I want to say that might have been the first decade where music was really important to a film, especially to a film that was targeted toward a teen or somebody in their early 20s. It's not to say that music wasn't used prior to that. It's always been used in film and very important in film. But culturally, I think it was huge. You can hear a lot of times when I'm playing songs, it's like, okay, I can see that scene in the film where they use the song. So I think it's a combination of things. There's just a lot of places to pull from with this. And I think, to answer your question in a very long way, that's why I think it resonates with people.
It's so interesting too, man, because like we were talking about back in the day, in the 80s, if you wanted to discover new music or you wanted to be exposed to music that you've never heard before, you had to hang out with certain people, right? You had to be in certain social groups and you had to make like a conscious effort to do that. Yes, you could just go to Tower Records or Licorice Pizza and I guess just start randomly browsing, but really you depended on your social group to tell you, because before 91X did the format change, for instance, we didn't even have any access to that music. What are we supposed to do? Go up to LA and go to a nightclub when you're 16 or 17? I can't even get in. But nowadays, one of the cool things, right, about Spotify and these other formats is I can easily get exposed to thousands of bands, right? Just by saying, hey, man, I love Devo. Play me some stuff that sounds like Devo. And I can't even tell you how awesome that is, to be able to broaden your horizons and now get exposed to all kinds of new music that you never would have known about. But very different method. Yeah.
I hear where you're coming from. I'm still going to say, we're not talking about the same two things right here, what I'm about to say, but nothing you can't, I don't care. It's going to be a long time, if ever, that AI or something that uses any kind of computer or technology like that to curate a playlist is ever going to be better than what a human being can do, because they can't find there's always the emotional aspect of what's there. And I'm telling you, I remember the first few years I was doing Legends of Alternative, I was going through a divorce and I was in a pretty melancholy place. And, I don't know that I consciously was trying to make people cry, but I was making people cry almost every show. And you can do that with music. I mean, I could put some songs together and, and have people cry. I could make them happy. I could, one of the things that we had a member of our group named Nora, and she passed away, which was really sad. Nora used to talk about waking the neighbors with the show. And, now we have Nora neighbor wakers that's part of the language. It's been interesting to watch this group happen and how it's just kind of taken its own life. I never in a million years am going to sit here and say I'm Steve. Steve was Steve. I'm Bryan. Now, am I trying to keep the essence of what Steve brought to it? Yes. But I'm also allowing this show to live and breathe and happen. I don't call people out using last names. It's their first name and their first initial. And it's kind of been embraced now. It's part of what it is. And I've been doing this thing for almost 5 years at this point. I've been doing this show, and I plan on doing it for as long as they'll let me do it. And I have a couple of rules. I don't want to play the same songs over and over again. So I keep track of everything. I can tell which date that I played something, and I try not to play anything within 3 months of the last time that I played it to keep the thing fresh. And there's so much music to pick from. It's easy to do. Yeah.
Well, I love the fact too, Bryan, that when you say I'm going to create a show today that's different than the one yesterday, I'm not going to repeat stuff unless it's relevant to what I'm trying to accomplish today from the mood and the tone. If we go back to the 80s, you largely depended on the radio to play that song again and again, because I can't even afford the album. I don't even have access to it or whatever it was. It's like, that is my way to hear it. Obviously, nowadays I can listen to any song, anytime, anywhere, any place. So it's really up to you, the curator, right, to walk me through some kind of a journey. And we don't have to worry about playing the same song over and over again to some extent, right?
Well, and you hit on an important thing, Jeff, when you talked about how, now you can just, it's on demand. I literally, when I put a Steve West Legends of Alternative show together, and I'm not doing this as much now as I was when I was doing the show while I was in Charleston, South Carolina, because I lived in Charleston for 4 years and was doing the show from there when I wasn't coming out here to see my fiance, who's now my wife.
Oh, good. There's a good. I like your story. Then it did go to a happy place. I like that. All right, you got to. Okay, good. All right, good. All right.
Yeah.
All right.
No, I because of this show, I also am now married again to, just an amazing woman who the number one thing that we share, a huge love for music.
I was going to say what a shock, and I did not mean that as any kind of a pun. I absolutely.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay,
that's all right.
Sorry.
Nicely done, Jeff. Good job.
Thank you. I wasn't intentional.
Yeah. No, but it's I would literally, get all the requests, put a Spotify playlist together, listen to the flow of how that show was going to go. I mean, I'd spend 10 to 12 hours on a 4-hour show. Just putting all the pieces together, man. Because I care
That's awesome.
that much about this is my craft. I see myself as an artist who has music at his fingertips to be able to put together my art. And I don't know, Jeff, you'd asked a question earlier about, having, or maybe it was you, Chris, about having passion, how important having passion was to doing this. I don't want to half-ass something when I'm doing this.
And you got into something, sorry, Matt, I was just going to say real quick, you got into something that I just did not expect, which is this whole second part of our conversation, which is creating moods and getting people to move through emotions, which you can absolutely do with music. But that's so effing cool that because you're not hamstrung to somebody saying you can only talk for 7 seconds, you got to play these songs, don't you effing dare go into a block, you mother effer. And instead be like, I'm crafting an experience. That is so freaking cool to me, that whole idea. I'd love to talk to you more about that when you have time.
Yeah.
No, I absolutely would love to do that. I will say that I'll end with this thought. And this was something that was absolutely amazing that happened as part of Steve West Legends of Alternative. A little while into doing Legends of Alternative, the company was going to put an alternative show on a national level. And it wasn't my show. And it was going to replace my show. And word got out, and people who are on our Facebook group page were very upset, extremely upset. And they were like, F the company, F this, screw these guys, let's boycott, all that kind of stuff. And I called Jeremy up and I said, man, is there any chance at all we can save this show? And he said, just get me emails, get me letters, get me stuff. So I went on the Facebook group page and I said, time out. Don't get mad. What I need from you is to write down from your heart what this show means to you. That's what I need. You want to save this show? Flipping your middle finger's not going to win. Let it come from your heart. And people did. And we saved that show.
I love it.
And
that's so great.
I was shocked that we were able to do that. Honestly, I thought for sure the big corporation, they're never going to let us keep it. The people who listen to this show every week, they saved the show. It's their show.
Well, that's even cooler for them. I mean, now it's like the sense of loyalty and onus and ownership is just like off the charts, man. That's so cool.
Jeff, that was great. Again, we talked so much about music and growing up and we even had that specific episode where we talked about the stations and the DJs. To have one of those DJs from one of those stations tell his story and share it here, that was great. That was a lot of fun. I had a good time. I learned stuff, and it almost like I was almost kind of just like listening to the point where like, should I be asking more questions? And it's just like, no, I'm just going to let him, it's like, no, I don't want to interrupt because this was great stories and great content from Bryan Schock. And I think that was just a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And like you, I learned a whole bunch about the early days of 91X that I was unaware of. And what a cool guy. We really look forward to having him back on the show and digging in even more. So very cool. What do you think, Chris? Until next time?
Till next time, Jeff.